In the grand secretive halls of Greystone Hall, a joyous engagement turns deadly when Julian Rutherford is poisoned, his glass laced with cyanide. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, unraveling a web of lies, blackmail, and betrayal. A forged note, a hidden vial, a French cigarette, every clue points to a killer among the guests. As alibis crumble and a dark family secret surfaces, Miss Marple's keen eye reveals a shocking truth that will leave you stunned. Who poisoned the charming fiancé, and what past crime haunts this elegant estate? Dive into a classic Agatha Christie mystery where nothing is as it seems. Chapter 1. The invitation to Greystone Hall. The late autumn sun hung low over the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the tidy gardens of the village. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically in her hands, sat by the window of her cottage, her sharp eyes scanning the quiet lane outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke, and the village seemed to hum with its usual understated rhythm. Yet, beneath the surface of this tranquil scene, Miss Marple sensed a ripple of unease, as though the world were holding its breath. It was mid-morning when the postman, young Tommy Pierce, pedaled up the path and delivered a letter, its envelope embossed with an elegant crest. Miss Marple's delicate fingers broke the seal, revealing an invitation written in a precise, looping hand. It was from Lady Beatrice Ashford, mistress of Greystone Hall, a grand estate some 10 miles from St. Mary Mead. The letter invited Miss Marple to a weekend gathering to celebrate the engagement of Lady Beatrice's niece, Clara Ashford, to a certain Mr. Julian Rutherford, a man of considerable charm and recent fortune. My dear Miss Marple, the letter began, your presence would lend such comfort to our little assembly. Clara speaks so highly of your wisdom, and I confess I should value your company amidst our varied guests. Do join us at Greystone Hall this Friday. Yours sincerely, Beatrice Ashford. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she folded the letter. Lady Beatrice was not known for sentimentality, and the invitation, though polite, carried an undertone of urgency. Clara, a bright and sensitive girl, had visited St. Mary Mead often, and Miss Marple had taken a liking to her. But Julian Rutherford? The name stirred a vague recollection, a whisper of scandal perhaps from a London acquaintance. Miss Marple's memory, like her knitting, was precise and unyielding, and she resolved to observe this young man closely. By Friday afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in a hired car, her modest suitcase beside her, as the vehicle wound through the misty lanes toward Greystone Hall. The estate loomed into view, a sprawling Georgian mansion of weathered stone, its windows glowing faintly against the gathering dusk. Ivy clung to the walls, and the grounds, though meticulously kept, seemed to whisper of secrets buried in their shadows. The car drew to a halt before the grand entrance, where Lady Beatrice herself awaited, a tall, imposing woman in her late 50s, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. Miss Marple, how good of you to come, she said, her voice warm but her eyes searching. Clara will be delighted. The hall's interior was as grand as its facade, with polished oak floors, towering portraits, and a chandelier that glittered like a constellation. Miss Marple was shown to her room, a cozy chamber overlooking the rose garden, and given time. to refresh before dinner. As she adjusted her lace shawl and pinned her brooch, she reflected on the guest list Lady Beatrice had mentioned in passing. Clara and Julian, of course. Dr. Ernest Caldwell, a local physician. Mrs. Lydia Warrender, a widowed cousin of Lady Beatrice. Mr. Felix Warrender, Lydia's aloof son. And Miss Evelyn Hartley, a sharp-tongued society friend of Clara's. There was also a Mr. Victor Langston, a solicitor handling the Ashford family affairs, and his wife, Mrs. Margaret Langston, known for her nervous disposition. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock in the oak-paneled dining room, where a long table gleamed with silver and crystal. Clara, radiant in a pale blue gown, sat beside Julian, a handsome man with dark hair and a disarming smile. Yet Miss Marple noted the way Clara's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass, and how Julian's eyes darted toward Lady Beatrice whenever she spoke. Dr. Caldwell, a stout man with a jovial air, regaled the table with tales of his practice, while Mrs. Warrender, her face pinched, said little. Felix, her son, seemed distracted, his gaze fixed on the flickering candles. Miss Hartley's laughter rang out too brightly, and Mr. Langston's attempts at conversation were met with his wife's anxious murmurs as the meal progressed. Miss Marple observed the undercurrents of tension. Lady Beatrice, though gracious, seemed to watch Julian with a guarded expression. Clara, for all her beauty, appeared strained, her smiles fleeting. And when Felix excused himself abruptly, citing a headache, Miss Marple noted the clock, 9:17 p.m., a seemingly trivial detail, but one she tucked away in her mind. After dinner, the party retired to the drawing-room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. Miss Marple, seated in a high-backed chair, declined a game of bridge in favor of her knitting. She listened as the others spoke of Clara's wedding plans, of the Ashford family's storied history, of Julian's recent success in the stock market. Yet her eyes missed nothing: the way Mrs. Langston clutched her husband's arm, the way Miss Hartley's gaze lingered on Julian, the way Lady Beatrice's fingers tightened around her locket when Clara mentioned her late father, Sir Henry Ashford. As the clock struck 10, a sudden cry pierced the air. It came from the direction of the library, a low, anguished wail that sent a chill through the room. Lady Beatrice rose, her face pale. "What on earth?" she began, but before she could finish, the butler, Mr. Grayson, appeared in the doorway. His usual composure shattered. "My lady," he stammered, "it's Mr. Rutherford. He's dead." A gasp rippled through the room. Clara swayed, clutching the arm of a chair, while Julian's face drained of color. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind already turning. The evening, so carefully orchestrated, had unraveled in an instant, and as the guests hurried toward the library, Miss Marple followed, her steps measured, her eyes sharp. Greystone Hall, she knew, was no longer a place of celebration. It was a stage for a crime, one she intended to unravel. Chapter 2. The scene in the library. The library of Greystone Hall was a cavernous room, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy oak shelves that stretched toward a vaulted ceiling. A single chandelier cast a dim glow, illuminating a scene that struck the assembled guests like a thunderclap. Julian Rutherford lay sprawled across the Persian rug, his face ashen, his eyes wide and unseeing. A crystal tumbler, its contents spilled, rested near his outstretched hand, and a faint, bitter scent lingered in the air. Miss Jane Marple, standing just inside the doorway, took in every detail with her usual meticulous care. Clara Ashford's scream broke the stunned silence. She rushed forward, only to be gently restrained by Dr. Ernest Caldwell, who knelt beside the body. "Stay back, my dear," he said, his voice steady but strained. "Let me examine him." His fingers pressed against Julian's wrist, then his neck, searching for a pulse. After a moment, he looked up at Lady Beatrice, who stood rigid at the threshold. "He's gone," Dr. Caldwell said quietly. "I'm afraid there's no doubt." "Gone?" Clara whispered, her face crumpling. "But how?" "He was perfectly well at dinner." Her eyes darted to the tumbler, and she clutched Dr. Caldwell's arm. Was it poison?" Miss Marple's gaze followed Clara's to the tumbler, noting the faint amber stain on the rug. She stepped closer, her small frame unassuming amidst the chaos, and observed the scene with a clarity that belied her gentle demeanor. The tumbler had been filled with whiskey, she deduced, from the scent and the decanter on a nearby table. But the bitter undertone suggested something more sinister. Her eyes flicked to the library's single window, slightly ajar, its curtains swaying in the night breeze. A small detail, but one that piqued her curiosity. Lady Beatrice, her composure regained, addressed the butler. "Mr. Grayson, fetch the police at once, Grayson, and ensure no one leaves the house." Her voice was firm, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands as she clasped them before her dot as Grayson hurried off. The guests crowded into the library, their faces a tableau of shock and suspicion. Mrs. Lydia Warrender, her lips pressed into a thin line, stood beside her son, Felix, who had returned from his earlier absence. His eyes were fixed on the body, his expression unreadable. Miss Evelyn Hartley, her usual vivacity subdued, clung to Mr. Victor Langston's arm, while his wife, Margaret, hovered near the doorway, wringing her hands. "This is dreadful," Margaret murmured. "Simply dreadful." Miss Marple moved quietly to the edge of the room, her knitting bag still in hand as she studied the guests. Each, she knew, would have a story to tell and secrets to hide. She noted the time on the mantel clock. 10:07 p.m., just 40 minutes, had passed since Felix's abrupt departure from the dining room, and less than 10 since the cry had summoned them here. Timing, she reflected, would be critical. Dr. Caldwell rose from his examination, his brow furrowed. "I can't be certain without a proper analysis, but the symptoms dilated pupils, the rigidity suggest a poison. Possibly cyanide, given the smell. The police will need to confirm." "Cyanide?" Miss Hartley gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "But who would do such a thing, and why?" "That," Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself, "is precisely what we must discover." Her voice was so quiet that only Clara, standing nearby, heard her. The young woman's eyes met Miss Marple's, wide with fear and something else, guilt, perhaps, or desperation. The sound of footsteps announced the arrival of Inspector Hargreaves, a burly man with a no-nonsense air, accompanied by a young constable. Lady Beatrice greeted him with a curt nod. "Inspector, thank you for coming so quickly. This is a terrible tragedy." Mr. Rutherford was to marry my niece, Clara. The inspector surveyed the room, his eyes lingering on the body. Right then. No one touches anything until we've had a proper look. Constable, secure the room. He turned to the guests. I'll need statements from everyone. Where were you all between 9 and 10 this evening? A murmur of alibis began, each guest eager to establish their whereabouts. Lady Beatrice had been in the drawing room, playing bridge with Dr. Caldwell, Miss Hartley, and Mr. Langston. Mrs. Langston claimed to have been in her room, feeling unwell. Clara said she had stepped out to the terrace for air, alone, at around 9:30. Felix, however, hesitated before answering. I was in the billiard room, he said at last, his voice low. I needed a moment to myself. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she listened, her mind cataloguing each statement. Felix's hesitation, Clara's solitary walk, the open window, all were threads in a tapestry she would soon unravel. She noted, too, the way Inspector Hargreaves focused on Clara, his questions sharp and probing. You were alone, Miss Ashford. No one saw you? Clara flushed. No, Inspector. I needed to think. The engagement, it's been overwhelming. The inspector's eyes narrowed, but before he could press further, Miss Marple interjected, her voice mild. Inspector, might I suggest examining the tumbler? The scent is quite distinctive, and the window, too, may be of interest. It was open when we entered. Hargreaves glanced at her, his expression a mix of irritation and curiosity. And you are Miss Jane Marple, she replied, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. A guest merely, but one who notices things. The inspector grunted but followed her suggestion, instructing the constable to bag the tumbler and check the window. As the police began their work, Miss Marple retreated to a corner, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The library, with its books and shadows, held the key to Julian Rutherford's death, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and razor-sharp mind, was determined to find it. Chapter 3. The arrival of Miss Marple's insight. The library of Greystone Hall, now a crime scene, buzzed with the quiet efficiency of Inspector Hargreaves and his constable. The guests had been ushered back to the drawing-room where the fire had dwindled to embers, casting flickering shadows across their strained faces. Miss Jane Marple, however, lingered near the library door, her presence unobtrusive yet deliberate. Inspector Hargreaves, noting her keen interest, had permitted her to remain, albeit with a skeptical glance. Don't touch anything, Miss Marple, he warned, to which she responded with a serene nod, her knitting needles clicking softly in her hands. The inspector's men had cordoned off the area around Julian Rutherford's body, which still lay on the rug, awaiting the coroner's arrival. The tumbler, now sealed in an evidence bag, sat on a side table, its bitter scent no longer detectable. The open window, which Miss Marple had pointed out, had been examined, revealing no signs of forced entry. Probably just left ajar for air, the constable muttered, but Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She did not believe in dismissing details so hastily. As the police continued their work, Miss Marple's mind turned to the guests, each of whom she had observed with her characteristic precision during dinner and its aftermath. Clara's trembling hands, Felix's abrupt departure, Miss Hartley's overly bright laughter, These were not mere quirks but pieces of a puzzle. She recalled, too, the locket Lady Beatrice had clutched, a small but telling gesture. Miss Marple knew that in a house like Greystone Hall, where wealth and propriety masked deeper currents, secrets were often hidden in plain sight. Inspector Hargreaves, wiping his brow, approached her. "Miss Marple, you seem uncommonly interested in this business. Care to share what's on your mind?" "Oh, Inspector," she replied, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp. "I am merely an old woman who notices things. For instance, the tumbler it held whiskey, yes, but was it poured from the decanter in this room? And the window open on such a chilly night. It makes one wonder." Hargreaves frowned, glancing at the decanter. "You think someone tampered with it?" "I think," Miss Marple said, folding her knitting, "that we must consider every possibility. Mr. Rutherford was a man of some importance, was he not? Engaged to Miss Ashford, welcomed into this fine family. Yet someone wished him dead. The question is, who and why?" The inspector grunted, unconvinced but intrigued. "We'll know more once the coroner confirms the poison. For now, I need to question the guests properly. Care to sit in, Miss Marple? You might notice something." Miss Marple inclined her head, delighted by the invitation. "I should be most happy to assist, Inspector, in my small way." They returned to the drawing room, where the guests sat in uneasy silence. Clara, pale and tearful, clutched a handkerchief, while Lady Beatrice stood by the mantel, her posture rigid. Dr. Caldwell was murmuring to Mrs. Langston, whose nervous fidgeting had intensified. Felix sat apart, staring into the fire, while Miss Hartley whispered to Mr. Langston, her eyes darting toward Clara. The air was thick with suspicion, and Miss Marple felt the weight of unspoken truths. Inspector Hargreaves cleared his throat. "Right, let's have it. I need precise accounts of your movements between 9 and 10 this evening. Miss Ashford, you first." Clara's voice trembled as she repeated her story. "I was on the terrace alone from about 9:30. I needed air. The engagement, it's been a lot to take in." "And no one saw you?" Hargreaves pressed. Clara shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twisted the handkerchief, a gesture of distress, but also, perhaps, concealment. Lady Beatrice spoke next, her tone crisp. "I was here, playing bridge with Dr. Caldwell, Miss Hartley, and Mr. Langston. We were all together until the cry came." Dr. Caldwell nodded. "Quite right. We were deep in a rubber, rather a good one, too, until that dreadful sound." Miss Hartley confirmed this, though her voice was less steady. "I was here, Inspector. I didn't even know Julian had gone to the library." Mr. Langston echoed her, adding, "My wife was upstairs, feeling poorly. She wasn't with us." Mrs. Langston, her voice barely above a whisper, said, "I was in my room, resting. I heard nothing until Grayson came for me." Felix, when pressed, repeated his earlier claim. "I was in the billiard room. I didn't see Julian or anyone else." Miss Marple's needles paused. Felix's alibi was solitary, like Clara's, and his hesitation earlier had not escaped her.
She made a mental note to revisit the billiard room later,
to see what it might reveal. Hargreaves turned to the butler, Mr. Grayson, who stood by the door. "And you, sir, where were you?" "I was in the servants' hall, Inspector, preparing the coffee tray," Grayson replied. I heard the cry and ran to the library at once. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to Grayson's hands, steady and calloused, betraying no sign of guilt. Yet she wondered about the coffee tray. Had it been served or left untouched? Another small detail, but one that might matter. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, piecing together the fragments of the evening. The open window suggested an outsider, but the locked gates of Greystone Hall made that unlikely. The poison, swift and deadly, required knowledge and opportunity, and the timing between 9:17, when Felix left the dining room, and 10 o'clock, when the cry was heard, narrowed the window of the crime. She spoke softly, almost to herself. It is curious, is it not, that Mr. Rutherford went to the library alone? And that the tumbler was found so near his hand, yet no one saw him pour the drink? Hargreaves glanced at her, his brow furrowing. You think someone handed it to him? I think, Miss Marple said, her voice mild, that we must ask why he went to the library at all. A man does not leave a lively gathering without reason. The room fell silent, the guests exchanging uneasy glances. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind alight with possibilities. Julian Rutherford's death was no random act. It was a calculated move, born of motive and opportunity. And as she watched the faces around her, she knew the truth lay hidden in their secrets she would uncover, one stitch at a time. Chapter 4. The questions deepen. The drawing room of Greystone Hall, despite its grandeur, felt stifling as Inspector Hargreaves continued his interrogations. The guests sat in a semicircle, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight, each expression a mask of varying degrees of fear, guilt, or defiance. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual unobtrusive corner, her knitting needles moving with quiet precision, observed the scene with her characteristic acuity. She noted the small gestures, the way Clara's eyes darted to Felix, the way Mrs. Langston's hands twisted her shawl, the way Lady Beatrice's gaze lingered on the portrait of her late brother, Sir Henry Ashford, above the mantel. Inspector Hargreaves, his notebook open, turned his attention to Mr. Victor Langston, the solicitor. Mr. Langston, you were playing bridge with Lady Beatrice, Dr. Caldwell, and Miss Hartley. Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Rutherford before he left the drawing room? Langston, a thin man with a meticulous air, adjusted his spectacles. Nothing out of the ordinary, Inspector. Julian seemed in good spirits, though perhaps a touch distracted. He excused himself shortly after dinner, saying he wished to fetch a book from the library. A book? Hargreaves raised an eyebrow. Did he mention which one? No, Langston replied, his tone measured. He was vague about it. I assumed he simply wanted a moment alone. Miss Marple's needles paused. A book, she thought, was an unlikely excuse for a man like Julian Rutherford, whose charm and social ease had been evident at dinner. She made a mental note to examine the library's shelves later, to see if any volumes stood out. Hargreaves turned to Miss Hartley, whose bright demeanor had dimmed considerably. Miss Hartley, you were close to Mr. Rutherford during dinner. Did he seem unwell? Any sign of distress? Evelyn Hartley's lips tightened, and she smoothed her skirt with a nervous gesture. He was perfectly well, Inspector. Laughing, talking about the wedding. If anything, he seemed overly attentive to Clara, but that's to be expected. Isn't it? They were engaged. Miss Marple noted the faint edge in Evelyn's voice, a hint of resentment that did not escape her. She recalled Evelyn's lingering glances at Julian during dinner and wondered if there was more to their acquaintance than friendship. Clara, hearing her name, spoke up, her voice trembling. Julian was happy, Inspector. We were planning our future. I don't understand how this could happen. Her eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in her handkerchief. Lady Beatrice placed a hand on her niece's shoulder, her expression a mixture of concern and resolve. Inspector, Clara is distraught. Perhaps we might continue this tomorrow. Hargreaves hesitated, then nodded. Very well, but no one leaves the house until I've spoken to everyone again. Miss Marple, have you anything to add? All eyes turned to the elderly woman, whose serene expression belied the sharpness of her mind. Only a small observation, Inspector, she said, her voice soft. Mr. Rutherford's tumbler, was it the only glass in the library? And the decanter, had it been used by others that evening? The inspector frowned, flipping through his notes. The constable noted only one glass, the one beside the body. As for the decanter, we'll have it tested for poison. Why do you ask? Miss Marple smiled faintly. It is merely that a man does not drink alone in a library unless he has a reason to be there. And if the poison was in the whiskey, we must ask how it came to be in that particular glass. A murmur rippled through the room. Felix Warrender shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, while Mrs. Langston let out a small gasp. Dr. Caldwell, however, leaned forward, his interest piqued. You're suggesting someone gave him the glass already poured? I suggest nothing, Dr. Caldwell, Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. I only wonder. Hargreaves closed his notebook with a snap. Right, we'll resume in the morning. Constable, ensure the library is locked. Lady Beatrice, I'll need a room for the night. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze drifting to the portrait of Sir Henry Ashford. She recalled Clara's mention of her father during dinner, and the way Lady Beatrice's fingers had tightened around her locket. There was a history here, she sensed, one that might hold the key to Julian's death. Later, as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple made her way to the billiard room, where Felix had claimed to be during the critical hour. The room was dimly lit, its green baize table untouched, the cues neatly racked. She examined the space carefully, noting a single cigarette butt in an ashtray, its brand unfamiliar. Felix had not smoked during dinner, nor had he mentioned doing so. Another small detail, but one that added to the growing tapestry in her mind. Returning to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, and reflected on the evening's events. The poison, the open window, the solitary glass, all pointed to a deliberate act, planned with care. But by whom? Clara, with her trembling hands and solitary walk? Felix, with his vague alibi and distant manner? Or someone else, whose motives lay buried in the shadows of Greystone Hall? As the clock struck midnight, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the library. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would examine it herself to see what secrets its shelves and shadows might reveal. For now, she set her knitting aside and prepared for bed, her mind as sharp as ever, weaving together the threads of a crime that was far from solved. Chapter 5. The red herrings emerged the morning after Julian Rutherford's death dawned grey and heavy, with a mist that clung to the grounds of Greystone Hall like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple, having risen early, sat in the breakfast room, her tea cooling beside her as she observed the subdued gathering of guests. The air was thick with tension, each person avoiding the other's eyes, their conversations stilted and brief. Clara Ashford, pale and drawn, picked at her toast, while Lady Beatrice maintained a stoic presence at the head of the table. Felix Warrender, his face shadowed, sat apart, and Miss Evelyn Hartley's usual vivacity was noticeably absent. Inspector Hargreaves arrived promptly at 9, his notebook in hand and his expression grim. The coroner's preliminary report, delivered earlier that morning, confirmed cyanide as the cause of Julian's death, likely ingested through the whiskey in the tumbler. The decanter, however, showed no traces of poison, suggesting the fatal dose had been added directly to the glass. This revelation, shared with the guests, sent a ripple of unease through the room. Miss Marple, her knitting resting in her lap, listened as Hargreaves announced his intention to conduct individual interviews. In the morning room, "We're dealing with murder," he said bluntly. "Someone in this house poisoned Mr. Rutherford, and I mean to find out who." The first to be questioned was Clara, whose tearful demeanor did little to deflect the inspector's scrutiny. "Miss Ashford," he began, "you were alone on the terrace between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. No one can confirm your whereabouts. And as Mr. Rutherford's fiancée, you had access to his movements. Did you bring him that drink?" Clara's eyes widened, her voice trembling. "No, Inspector. I would never. Julian was everything to me. I was on the terrace, yes, but I didn't go near the library." Miss Marple, permitted to sit in on the interviews, noted the desperation in Clara's voice, but also the way her hands clutched her skirt, as if anchoring herself against a storm of emotion. The inspector, however, pressed on. "You stand to inherit a great deal, Miss Ashford, with your father's estate tied up in trusts. Was Mr. Rutherford's wealth part of your plans?" Clara flushed, her voice rising. "That's a cruel thing to say. I loved him. I didn't care about his money." Hargreaves jotted a note, his expression unyielding. Miss Marple, however, tilted her head slightly, recalling a conversation at dinner where Julian had boasted of a recent financial windfall. Money, she knew, was often a motive, but Clara's distress seemed genuine. Or was it too perfect a performance? Next came Felix Warrender, whose aloof manner had hardened into defiance. "I told you, Inspector, I was in the billiard room," he said, his voice clipped. "I didn't see Julian after dinner." Hargreaves leaned forward. "The billiard room is just down the hall from the library, Mr. Warrender. Convenient, wouldn't you say? And we found a cigarette butt there, French, not a brand you'd find in St. Mary Mead. Care to explain?" Felix's jaw tightened, but he shrugged. "I don't smoke. Someone else must have left it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. The cigarette butt, which she had noticed the previous night, was indeed an anomaly. Felix's denial only deepened her curiosity. Had he been in the billiard room at all, or was his alibi a fabrication? As the interviews continued, a pattern emerged. Each guest pointed to another, subtly or overtly, as a potential suspect. Miss Hartley suggested Clara's engagement had been rushed. Hinting at doubts about her devotion, Dr. Caldwell mentioned Felix's strained relationship with Lady Beatrice, his aunt, over family finances. Mr. Langston, the solicitor, alluded to Julian's recent business dealings, which had ruffled feathers in London. Mrs. Langston, trembling, said little but flinched when Julian's name was mentioned. By midday, Hargreaves was visibly frustrated, his notebook filled with conflicting accounts. The guests' alibis, while plausible, lacked corroboration, and the absence of the poisoned source cyanide was not a household item deepened the mystery. The inspector turned to Miss Marple, who had remained silent throughout. "Well, Miss Marple, you've been watching like a hawk. Any thoughts?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes bright. "It is curious, Inspector, how everyone seems so eager to point elsewhere. But I wonder about the library itself. Mr. Rutherford went there for a book, we're told, yet no book was found near him. And the window open, yet no footprints in the garden below. It suggests the poisoner was someone already inside the house." Hargreaves frowned. "You're saying it's one of them, but the glass only Julian's prints were on it." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "Which means the poison was placed in the glass before he touched it, by someone who knew he would drink." The inspector's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a commotion at the door interrupted them. Mr. Grayson, the butler, entered, his face pale. "Inspector, my lady," he said, addressing Lady Beatrice, "we've found something in the library, a small vial hidden behind a book on the shelf." The room fell silent. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. The vial, she suspected, was a red herring, a clue planted to mislead, but by whom and why? As Hargreaves hurried to the library, she followed, her mind already sifting through the morning's revelations. The cigarette butt, the vial, Clara's tears, Felix's defiance, all were threads in a web of deception, and Miss Marple was determined to untangle them. Chapter 6. A clue in detail. The library of Greystone Hall, now bathed in the pale light of a misty afternoon, seemed to hold its secrets more tightly than ever. Inspector Hargreaves stood before the towering bookshelf where the butler, Mr. Grayson, had discovered the small glass vial, its contents long since evaporated, but bearing the faint, acrid scent of cyanide. The vial, no larger than a thimble, had been tucked behind a volume of The Complete Angler, an incongruous hiding place that struck Miss Jane Marple as deliberate. She stood quietly to one side, her knitting bag at her feet, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. "This changes things," Hargreaves declared, holding the vial in a gloved hand. "Whoever hid this had access to the library and to cyanide. Grayson, you're certain this wasn't here earlier?" The butler, his composure strained, nodded. "I dust the shelves daily, Inspector. I would have noticed it." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The vial's placement, so easily found yet so carefully concealed, suggested a calculated move, perhaps to divert suspicion or to implicate someone specific. She glanced at the guests who had been summoned to the library's threshold but kept back by the constable. Their faces betrayed a mix of fear and curiosity. Clara's eyes were red-rimmed, Felix's jaw was set, and Miss Hartley's usual poise seemed to waver. Hargreaves turned to the group. "This vial suggests premeditation. Someone in this house planned Mr. Rutherford's death. I'll need to know who had access to the library last night. Lady Beatrice, her voice steady, spoke first. The library is open to all guests, Inspector. Anyone could have entered after dinner. Anyone? Hargreaves pressed, his gaze sweeping the room. Miss Ashford, you were on the terrace, close to the library window. Did you see anyone near it? Clara shook her head, her voice barely audible. No, Inspector. It was dark and I was preoccupied. Miss Marple noted the hesitation in Clara's words, the way her fingers twisted her handkerchief. Preoccupied, she thought, or hiding something. She made a mental note to speak with Clara privately, to probe the source of her unease. Felix Warrender, under Hargreaves' scrutiny, reiterated his alibi. I was in the billiard room, as I said. I didn't come near the library. And yet, Hargreaves said, holding up the vial, this was found not far from where you claim to have been. And that cigarette butt in the billiard room. French, you said you don't smoke. Care to explain? Felix's eyes flashed with irritation. I don't know how it got there. Someone else must have been in the billiard room. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she listened. The cigarette butt, the vial, these were clues that pointed too neatly at Felix, almost as if designed to do so. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a misplaced handkerchief had led the police astray, only to reveal a deeper truth. Red herrings, she knew, were often the work of a clever mind. As Hargreaves continued questioning, Miss Marple slipped away to examine the bookshelf herself, her movements unnoticed by the others. She studied the volume of The Complete Angler, noting its slightly askew position as if it had been hastily replaced. Beside it, a faint smudge of dust on the shelf suggested something had been moved recently. She crouched, her eyes scanning the lower shelves, and spotted a single, overlooked detail, a tiny scrap of paper wedged beneath a neighboring book. With delicate fingers, she retrieved it, a torn corner of a letter bearing the words "Meet me" in a hurried script. Miss Marple tucked the scrap into her sleeve, her mind racing. The note, though incomplete, suggested a rendezvous, perhaps in the library itself. Had Julian been lured there under false pretenses, and if so, by whom? Returning to the group, she caught Dr. Caldwell's eye. The physician, who had been quiet during the questioning, was watching Felix with an intensity that piqued her interest. Dr. Caldwell, she said softly, drawing him aside, you mentioned at dinner that you knew Mr. Rutherford from London. Did he have any enemies, perhaps? Caldwell hesitated, his jovial demeanor fading. Enemies? Not that I'd call them that, but Julian was ambitious. He'd made a fortune quickly, and not everyone approved of his methods. There were rumors, debts, shady deals. Nothing concrete, mind you. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind cataloging this new information. Debts and shady deals could provide motive, especially in a house where money and status were paramount. She glanced at Mr. Langston, the solicitor, whose role in the Ashford family affairs might give him insight into Julian's finances. As the interviews concluded, Hargreaves announced that the vial would be sent for analysis, though he doubted it would yield fingerprints. Whoever did this was careful, he said, his voice grim. But they've made a mistake somewhere. They always do. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her thoughts elsewhere. The vial, the note, the cigarette, but these were not mistakes but pieces of a deliberate puzzle. She recalled Lady Beatrice's locket, clutched so tightly during dinner, and wondered if it held a clue to the family's past. The library, she decided, warranted another visit, preferably when the house was quiet. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the open window. The mist outside had thickened, obscuring the garden, but she sensed that the truth was not far off. A single detail, overlooked by all but her, would soon bring the picture into focus. For now, she returned to her knitting, her mind weaving together the threads of a crime that was as intricate as it was deadly. Chapter 7. More lies surfaced. The mist that enveloped Greystone Hall seemed to seep into the very walls. Underscore byline as the afternoon of the second day wore on, lending an air of oppressive gloom to the grand estate. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing room with her knitting, felt the weight of the atmosphere, not merely from the weather but from the secrets that hung heavily among the guests. The discovery of the vial in the library had sharpened Inspector Hargreaves' focus, and the tension among the suspects was palpable, each glance and gesture laden with unspoken accusations. The inspector had spent the morning re-interviewing the staff, while the guests, confined to the house, drifted between strained silence and forced pleasantries. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the subtle shifts in behavior: Clara's withdrawn demeanor, Felix's restless pacing, and Mrs. Langston's incessant fidgeting. Lady Beatrice, though composed, seemed to carry an invisible burden, her eyes often straying to the portrait of her late brother, Sir Henry Ashford. As luncheon was served, a sombre affair of cold meats and tea, Miss Marple seized the opportunity to engage Mr. Victor Langston, the solicitor, in quiet conversation. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice gentle, "you mentioned Mr. Rutherford's business dealings last night. Were they of a nature that might have caused resentment?" Langston's fork paused midway to his mouth, his eyes narrowing. "Resentment, Miss Marple? I suppose any man who makes a fortune quickly makes enemies. Julian had a knack for investments, but some said he played fast and loose with trust." "Trust," Miss Marple mused, her needles clicking. "A fragile thing, is it not? Especially in matters of money." Langston nodded, his expression guarded. "Indeed, the Ashford estate is substantial, and Julian's engagement to Clara brought him close to it. Not everyone was pleased." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to Felix, who sat across the room, his plate untouched. "Not everyone," she repeated softly, her mind turning to the cigarette butt in the billiard room and Felix's solitary alibi. Meal was interrupted by Inspector Hargreaves' arrival, his face grim. "Miss Marple, Lady Beatrice, a word, please," he said, beckoning them to the morning room. The guests exchanged wary glances as the trio departed. In the morning room, Hargreaves revealed a new discovery. "We found a letter in Mr. Rutherford's room, hidden in his suitcase. It's illuminating." He produced a folded sheet, its edges worn, and read aloud, "Julian, you cannot continue this charade. Meet me in the library at 9:30. We must settle this. It's unsigned." Lady Beatrice's face paled, her hand gripping the arm of her chair. "Who wrote it?" she asked, her voice low. "That's what I mean to find out," Hargreaves replied. The handwriting will be compared to samples from everyone in the house. Miss Marple, any thoughts? Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind recalling the scrap of paper she had found in the library, bearing the words, "Meet me." "It is curious, Inspector," she said, "that the note was hidden, yet the vial was not. One might think the poisoner wished to be discovered or to incriminate another." Hargreaves frowned. "You're suggesting a setup?" "I suggest," she said mildly, "that we consider the relationships in this house. Mr. Rutherford's death benefits someone, but whom? And why was the note unsigned?" Lady Beatrice's eyes met Miss Marple's, a flicker of unease passing between them. Julian was not universally liked, she admitted. His swift rise to wealth raised questions, and his engagement to Clara, it was sudden. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the locket Lady Beatrice wore, which she had clutched so tightly during dinner. "Sudden," she echoed, "and perhaps unwelcome to some." The conversation was cut short by a knock at the door. Mr. Grayson entered, his face ashen. "Inspector, there's been a development. Mrs. Warrender wishes to speak with you. She says she has something to confess." The three hurried to the drawing room, where Mrs. Lydia Warrender stood, her pinched face even paler than usual. The other guests watched in tense silence as she addressed Hargreaves, her voice trembling. "Inspector, I cannot keep silent any longer. Last night I saw something, or rather, someone. I was in the corridor near the library at 9:45, and I saw Felix leaving the room." A gasp rippled through the room. Felix shot to his feet, his face flushed. "That's a lie, Mother. I was in the billiard room." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Felix, but I saw you. You were hurrying away, looking agitated. I didn't want to believe it, but—" Hargreaves turned to Felix, his notebook open. "Is this true, Mr. Warrender?" Felix's hands clenched into fists. "No. She's mistaken or lying. I wasn't there." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her mind racing. Lydia's accusation, so sudden and specific, felt rehearsed, yet her distress appeared genuine. Was she protecting someone, or deflecting suspicion from herself? The cigarette butt, the vial, the note all pointed to Felix, yet Miss Marple sensed a deeper truth. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such accusations before, often born of fear or manipulation. As Hargreaves pressed Felix for answers, Miss Marple slipped the scrap of paper from her sleeve, studying it briefly. The handwriting, though incomplete, bore a faint resemblance to the note Hargreaves had described. She resolved to compare them later, for the truth, she knew, lay in the details that someone had taken great pains to obscure. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The Drawing Room of Greystone Hall seemed to shrink under the weight of Mrs. Lydia Warrender's accusation, the air thick with suspicion and unspoken fears. Felix Warrender stood rigid, his face a mask of fury and disbelief as his mother's words hung between them. The other guests, frozen in their seats, watched the scene unfold, their eyes darting between Felix, Lydia, and Inspector Hargreaves, who clutched his notebook with renewed intensity. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner, her knitting needles still for once, observed the drama with a calm that belied the sharpness of her mind. "Mrs. Warrender," Hargreaves said, his voice steady but probing, "you're certain you saw Your son leaving the library at 9:45? This is a serious claim. Lydia's hands trembled as she clasped them before her, her eyes glistening with tears. I know what I saw, Inspector. Felix was there, hurrying down the corridor. He looked distressed. I didn't want to believe it, but I cannot lie. Felix's voice rose, sharp with indignation. Mother, how can you say this? I was in the billiard room, as I've told you all. Why would you accuse me? Lydia's composure cracked, a sob escaping her lips. Oh, Felix, I'm so sorry. But I saw you, and I couldn't keep silent. Not when a man is dead. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind sifting through the scene. Lydia's distress was palpable, yet there was something staged in its intensity, as if she were playing a part. She dreaded. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known women like Lydia, mothers torn between loyalty and truth, or perhaps driven by motives less pure. The cigarette butt, the vial, and now this accusation all pointed to Felix, yet the pattern felt too neat, too contrived. Hargreaves turned to Felix, his expression stern. Mr. Warrender, this puts you at the scene of the crime. Care to explain? I've nothing to explain, Felix snapped, his voice tight. I wasn't in the library. My mother is mistaken, or someone's put her up to this. The room fell silent, the accusation hanging like a storm cloud. Clara Ashford, her face pale, clutched her handkerchief, while Lady Beatrice's lips tightened, her gaze fixed on Lydia. Miss Evelyn Hartley, usually quick with a quip, remained silent, her eyes darting nervously to Felix. Mr. Langston cleared his throat as if to speak, but his wife's sharp tug on his arm silenced him. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice cutting through the tension. Mrs. Warrender, might I ask what brought you to the corridor at that hour? It is, after all, some distance from the drawing room. Lydia hesitated, her hands twisting her shawl. I was looking for Felix. He'd left dinner so abruptly. And I was worried. I thought he might have gone to the library. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. Lydia's explanation was plausible, yet it raised questions. Why seek Felix in the library rather than the billiard room, where he claimed to be? And why had she waited until now to reveal what she saw? The scrap of paper in Miss Marple's sleeve, the one bearing the words, "Meet me," seemed to pulse with significance. She resolved to compare its handwriting to the note found in Julian's room. Hargreaves, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, pressed Lydia further. Did you see anyone else in the corridor, Mrs. Warrender? Or here? Anything unusual? Lydia shook her head, her voice faltering. No, Inspector. Only Felix. It was quiet except for a faint sound like a glass clinking from the library. The mention of the glass sent a ripple through the room. Hargreaves jotted a note, his eyes narrowing. A clinking glass? You're sure? Yes, Lydia whispered, her gaze dropping. I thought nothing of it at the time. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a soft counterpoint to the tension. The clinking glass, she thought, could be significant or another carefully placed distraction. She recalled the library's layout, the decanter and glasses on a side table, the open window, the book out of place. Each detail was a thread. and Lydia's tearful confession was pulling them tighter. As Hargreaves prepared to question Felix further, Clara suddenly stood, her voice breaking the silence. "Inspector, I can't bear this. Felix didn't do it, I know he didn't, but I must tell you something." Her hands trembled, and she glanced at Lady Beatrice, who stiffened. "Julian and I, we argued last night before dinner. He was secretive about his business, and I pressed him. He was angry, said I didn't trust him. I went to the terrace to clear my head, but I didn't see Felix or anyone else." The room erupted in murmurs. Hargreaves' pen paused, his eyes sharp. "An argument, Miss Ashford? About what, exactly?" Clara's voice wavered. "Money, his investments. He wouldn't tell me details, only that they were risky. I was afraid for our future." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind was alert. Clara's confession, like Lydia's, was a turning point, revealing cracks in the facade of Greystone Hall. An argument over money, a hidden note, a vial of poison, each pointed to a motive rooted in trust, or the lack of it. She thought of Lady Beatrice's locket and the way Clara's eyes had lingered on her aunt during dinner. There was a history here, she sensed, one tied to the Ashford family and its wealth. Hargreaves closed his notebook with a snap. "This is getting us somewhere. Miss Ashford, Mr. Warrender, you'll both be questioned again. For now no one leaves this house." As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on Lydia, who sat weeping quietly. Felix stormed out, his face dark with anger. Clara, trembling, was led away by Lady Beatrice. Miss Marple slipped the scrap of paper from her sleeve, studying it anew. The truth, she knew, was close hidden in the lies that had surfaced, waiting for her to unravel it. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The evening shadows deepened over Greystone Hall, the mist outside curling against the windows like a living thing. The atmosphere within was no less oppressive. As the guests gathered in the drawing room under Inspector Hargreaves' watchful eye, Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the crackling fire, observed the strained faces around her. Clara Ashford sat pale and silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Felix Warrender, still bristling from his mother's accusation, avoided her gaze, while Mrs. Lydia Warrender herself seemed diminished, her eyes red from crying. Lady Beatrice maintained her regal composure, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her fingers as she adjusted her locket. Inspector Hargreaves stood before the hearth, his presence commanding. "I've had enough of half-truths," he said, his voice cutting through the room's tension. "We have a vial, a note, a cigarette butt, and conflicting alibis. Someone in this room knows more than they're saying, and I intend to find out who." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes bright with anticipation. She had seen such moments before in St. Mary Mead, when the pressure of a gathering, skillfully applied, could unravel the tightest of secrets.
She sensed Hargreaves was about to lay a trap,
and she was eager to see how the guilty would react. Hargreaves held up the letter found in Julian Rutherford's room, its hurried script visible to all. This note, unsigned, lured Mr. Rutherford to the library at 9:30. We've compared the handwriting to samples from everyone here. It matches none, but it's close to one. His eyes swept the room, lingering on Felix. Mr. Warrender, your mother places you at the library at 9:45. Care to revise your story? Felix's face darkened. I've told you, I was in the billiard room. My mother's mistaken, or she's lying to protect someone else. Lydia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Felix, how can you say that? I only spoke the truth. Miss Marple's gaze flickered to Lydia, noting the way her distress seemed to intensify under scrutiny. Was it guilt, fear, or something else? She recalled the scrap of paper in her sleeve, its "Meet me" matching the note's tone. The handwriting, she suspected, was a deliberate misdirection, perhaps forged to cast suspicion. Hargreaves turned to Clara. Miss Ashford, you admitted to arguing with Mr. Rutherford about his finances. Did you write this note, asking him to meet you? Clara shook her head vehemently, her voice trembling. No, Inspector. I was on the terrace. I didn't even know he was in the library until the cry. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but clear. Inspector, might I suggest we consider the timing? The note specifies 9:30, yet Mrs. Warrender saw Felix or someone at 9:45. If the poison was fast-acting, as Dr. Caldwell suggested, Mr. Rutherford must have drunk from the glass shortly before his death. Who was with him in those final moments? Hargreaves nodded, seizing the opportunity. Exactly. So let's have it out. I propose we reconstruct the evening. Everyone, state exactly where you were at 9:30, and we'll see who could have been in the library. The guests shifted uneasily there. Alibis reiterated with varying degrees of conviction. Lady Beatrice, Dr. Caldwell, Miss Hartley, and Mr. Langston confirmed their bridge game in the drawing room, corroborated by Mr. Grayson, who had been preparing coffee nearby. Mrs. Langston repeated her claim of resting upstairs, her nervous demeanor unchanged. Clara clung to her terrace story, and Felix, his voice tight, insisted on the billiard room. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm as she listened, her mind piecing together the puzzle. The bridge game accounted for 4, but the library was only a short walk from the drawing room. Mrs. Langston's solitary alibi was as flimsy as Felix's, and Clara's terrace walk remained uncorroborated. The note, the vial, the cigarette, but all seemed designed to point to Felix, yet Miss Marple sensed a deeper game at play. Hargreaves, sensing the moment was ripe, pressed further. Let's try this another way. Suppose someone slipped the poison into Mr. Rutherford's glass before he reached the library. Who had access to the whiskey tray in the drawing room? Mr. Grayson, standing by the door, spoke up. The tray was in the drawing room until 9:15, sir. I moved it to the library myself at Mr. Rutherford's request. He said he wanted a quiet drink while reading. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. And was the tumbler already poured, Mr. Grayson? The butler hesitated. No, madam. The decanter and glasses were on the tray, untouched. Mr. Rutherford poured his own drink, I assume. An assumption, Miss Marple said softly, that may prove dangerous. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Hargreaves seized the moment, his voice rising. Someone in this room gave Mr. Rutherford that glass, or tampered with it. And I believe that someone is here now, watching us. Speak, or I'll have this house searched top to bottom." The pressure broke something in Mrs. Langston, who let out a choked sob. "Oh, stop it. I can't bear it," she cried, her hands wringing her shawl. I saw something too. Last night, in the corridor near the library, I saw Miss Hartley. She was coming from that direction just before 10. She looked furtive." Miss Hartley's head snapped up, her face flushing. "That's absurd. I was playing bridge all evening. Everyone saw me." "Not at 9:45, Mrs. Langston whispered, her voice trembling. "You stepped away for a moment, said you needed air. I saw you near the library." The accusation hung in the air, a new thread in the tangled web. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting Mrs. Langston's nervous demeanor to her sudden revelation. Was she deflecting, or had she truly seen Evelyn? The trap, she realized, was working not to catch the guilty, but to reveal the cracks in their stories. As Hargreaves turned to question Miss Hartley, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the locket Lady Beatrice wore and the portrait of Sir Henry Ashford. The truth, she sensed, lay not just in the library, but in the history of this family, a history she would soon uncover. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The drawing room of Greystone Hall was a crucible of tension, the flickering firelight casting long shadows across the faces of the gathered guests. Inspector Hargreaves stood at the center, his notebook closed, his gaze steady as he surveyed the assembly. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner, her knitting needles silent, watched with keen interest. She sensed the moment had come. The trap, carefully set, had stirred the guilty, and now the truth would unravel. Hargreaves cleared his throat, his voice commanding. "We've heard alibis, accusations, and half-truths. A man is dead, poisoned in this very house, and the evidence points to someone here. It's time to lay it all bare." The guests shifted uneasily. Clara Ashford clutched her handkerchief, her eyes wide with fear. Felix Warrender's jaw was set, his earlier defiance tempered by a wary silence. Mrs. Lydia Warrender, pale and trembling, avoided her son's gaze. Miss Evelyn Hartley, her usual poise frayed, sat rigid while Mr. and Mrs. Langston exchanged nervous glances. Lady Beatrice, standing by the mantel, her hand resting near her locket, maintained an air of stoic resolve. Miss Marple, invited by Hargreaves to share her observations, rose slowly, her small frame belying the sharpness of her mind. "Inspector." "If I may," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The death of Mr. Rutherford was no accident. It was a crime of precision, planned with care, and the clues, though scattered, tell a story." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "Let us begin with the note found in Mr. Rutherford's room, unsigned, urging him to meet in the library at 9:30. Then the vial of cyanide, hidden behind a book. The cigarette butt in the billiard room where Felix claimed to be. And the tumbler, bearing only Mr. Rutherford's fingerprints. These suggest a deliberate act, but also a deliberate misdirection." Hargreaves nodded, encouraging her to continue. Miss Marple's voice grew steadier, her words weaving the threads of the case together. "The note, I believe, was not written by the killer but planted to lure suspicion. The handwriting, though close to some in this house, was carefully disguised. The vial, too conveniently found, was meant to point to Felix, as was the cigarette butt, a French brand, yet Felix does not smoke. These are red herrings designed to obscure the truth. She turned to Clara. Miss Ashford, you admitted to arguing with Mr. Rutherford about his finances. You were on the terrace alone at 9:30, yet I wonder if you saw more than you've said. Your distress is genuine, but is it for love or guilt? Clara's face crumpled, tears spilling. I didn't kill him. I loved Julian, despite our argument. I was on the terrace, I swear. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze softening. I believe you, my dear, but someone used your absence to their advantage. She turned to Felix. Mr. Warrender, your mother placed you at the library at 9:45, yet you insist you were in the billiard room. The cigarette butt suggests someone else was there, perhaps to frame you. But your alibi is weak, and your anger at Mr. Rutherford was no secret. Felix's eyes flashed. I didn't like him, but I didn't kill him. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mrs. Warrender. Mrs. Warrender, your accusation against your son was heartfelt, yet it came late. Were you protecting someone or deflecting suspicion from yourself? Lydia's hands trembled, her voice a whisper. I only said what I saw. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she turned to Miss Hartley. And you, Miss Hartley, were seen near the library by Mrs. Langston, despite claiming to be at bridge. Your feelings for Mr. Rutherford were warmer than friendship, were they not? Evelyn's face flushed, but she said nothing, her silence damning. Finally, Miss Marple faced Lady Beatrice, whose hand tightened around her locket. Lady Beatrice, this house holds many secrets, does it not? Your brother, Sir Henry Ashford, died under mysterious circumstances, and Mr. Rutherford's sudden wealth and engagement to Clara stirred old wounds. The locket you wear, it belonged to him, did it not? Lady Beatrice's composure wavered, her voice low. Yes, it was Henry's, but what does that have to do with this? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Everything. The truth lies in the past. Mr. Rutherford was not what he seemed. His wealth came not from investments, but from blackmail. He knew a secret about Sir Henry's death, a secret someone in this house would kill to keep. A gasp rippled through the room. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but relentless. The poison was in the whiskey, but not the decanter. The tumbler was handed to Mr. Rutherford, already laced with cyanide, by someone he trusted. The note lured him to the library, where he met his killer. And that killer is you, Lady Beatrice. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Lady Beatrice's face paled, her hand clutching the locket. That's preposterous. Why would I kill my niece's fiancé? Because, Miss Marple said, Julian Rutherford was blackmailing you. He had evidence that Sir Henry's death was not an accident but a murder committed by you to secure the Ashford estate. Clara's engagement brought him closer to the family, and his demands grew. You poisoned his drink using cyanide from the garden shed where you tend your roses. The vial and note were planted to implicate Felix, whose dislike of Julian was well known. Hargreaves stepped forward, his voice sharp. Lady Beatrice, is this true? Lady Beatrice's shoulders slumped, her face crumpling. He was going to ruin us, she whispered. Henry's death. It was a moment of madness, years ago. Julian found letters, proof. He demanded everything money, Clara, the estate. I couldn't let him destroy us. Clara sobbed, turning away. while the others stared in stunned silence. Hargreaves signaled the constable. "Lady Beatrice Ashford, you're under arrest for the murder of Julian Rutherford." As Lady Beatrice was led away, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression serene. The truth, as always, had been in the details: the locket, the note, the poison's source. Greystone Hall, with its secrets laid bare, would never be the same. Chapter 11. The reflection. The drawing room of Greystone Hall, once a stage for secrets and subterfuge, now felt eerily still as the reality of Lady Beatrice's confession settled over the remaining guests. The fire had burned low, casting a faint glow on the somber faces of Clara Ashford, Felix Warrender, Mrs. Lydia Warrender, Miss Evelyn Hartley, and Mr. and Mrs. Langston. Inspector Hargreaves, his duty fulfilled, oversaw the formalities of Lady Beatrice's arrest, while Miss Jane Marple remained in her corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, a quiet anchor amidst the storm of emotions. Clara, her eyes red from weeping, sat crumpled in an armchair, her handkerchief a sodden ball in her hands. Felix stood by the window, staring into the mist, his expression a mix of relief and lingering anger. Mrs. Warrender, her accusation against her son now overshadowed by Lady Beatrice's guilt, seemed diminished, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Miss Hartley, her usual sparkle extinguished, sat in silence, while the Langstons murmured to each other, their relief palpable but tempered by the weight of the revelation. Hargreaves, his notebook tucked away, addressed the room. "This has been a grim affair, but thanks to Miss Marple's insight, we've uncovered the truth. Lady Beatrice will face justice for Mr. Rutherford's murder, and it seems for Sir Henry Ashford's as well." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes gentle but piercing as she spoke. "It is always a sad thing, Inspector, when a family's secrets lead to such tragedy. Lady Beatrice believed she was protecting her legacy, but in doing so, she destroyed it." Clara's voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. "Aunt Beatrice, how could she? My father. And now Julian." Her words dissolved into a sob, and Dr. Caldwell, who had remained quietly supportive, moved to her side, offering a comforting hand. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "My dear, you could not have known. Lady Beatrice's actions were born of fear of losing what she held dear. Mr. Rutherford, I'm afraid, was not the man you believed him to be. His wealth, his charm, they masked a darker intent." Felix turned from the window, his voice low. "You mean the blackmail? How did you know, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly, her fingers resting on her knitting. "It was in the details. Mr. Warrender, the locket Lady Beatrice wore, so often clutched when your uncle, Sir Henry, was mentioned. The note in Mr. Rutherford's room, carefully planted to mislead. The vial, too conveniently found. And the garden shed where Lady Beatrice tended her roses. I recalled that cyanide is sometimes used in pest control. These were not random clues but a pattern, pointing to a truth hidden in the past." Hargreaves nodded, his respect for Miss Marple evident. "You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple. That locket, did it really hold a clue?" "It held a memory," she replied. "A photograph of Sir Henry, I suspect, kept close as a reminder of her guilt. When I saw her clutch it during dinner, I began to wonder about her connection to his death. Mr. Rutherford's sudden wealth and his engagement to Clara suggested he knew something worth killing for. Mrs. Warrender spoke up, her voice trembling. I accused Felix to protect the family. I thought he might have acted out of anger, but I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Felix. Felix's expression softened, though his reply was curt. You should have trusted me, Mother. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Trust, Mrs. Warrender, is a fragile thing, easily broken by fear. You saw what you feared to see, but it helped reveal the truth. Miss Hartley, her voice subdued, added, I suppose I was foolish too, thinking Julian cared for me. He was persuasive, but I didn't kill him. No, Miss Marple said gently, you did not. But your feelings for him clouded your judgment, as did Mrs. Langston's fear and Mr. Langston's caution. Each of you played a part in this drama, though none wielded the poison. Hargreaves cleared his throat. I'll need statements from everyone to close the case, but for now, you're free to rest. Miss Marple, will you stay on? Miss Marple shook her head, rising with her knitting bag in hand. I think, Inspector, my work here is done. Greystone Hall has revealed its secrets, and I have a garden to tend in St. Mary Mead. As she made her way to her room, Clara followed, her voice hesitant. Miss Marple, how did you see what we couldn't? All those little things? Miss Marple paused, her smile warm. My dear, it is the little things that matter. A glance, a gesture, a misplaced book, they tell a story, if one listens. In my village, I have seen human nature at its best and worst. It is always the same, whether in a cottage or a grand hall. Clara nodded, her eyes brimming. Thank you. I don't know what we'd have done without you. Miss Marple patted her hand. You will heal in time. Trust your heart, but also your mind. As she packed her modest suitcase, Miss Marple reflected on the case. Greystone Hall, with its polished surfaces and hidden shadows, was a microcosm of human frailty. Lady Beatrice's crime, born of desperation, had unraveled a family, but it had also freed Clara from a dangerous illusion. The locket, the note, the poison, they were but tools of a deeper truth that secrets, left unchecked, could destroy. With a final glance at the misty grounds, Miss Marple stepped into the waiting car, her mind already turning to the quiet of St. Mary Mead. The case was closed, but human nature, she knew, would always provide another puzzle. Chapter 12. The Echoes of Truth. The morning after Lady Beatrice's arrest, Greystone Hall seemed to exhale, its grand rooms quieter, as if relieved of the burden of secrets. The mist outside had lifted slightly, revealing the stark outlines of the estate's gardens, but an air of melancholy lingered. Miss Jane Marple, having agreed to stay one more day at Inspector Hargreaves' request to clarify details for his report, sat in the morning room, her knitting a steady rhythm against the silence. The guests, though no longer confined, moved. With a subdued caution, their interactions marked by the weight of the previous night's revelations. Clara Ashford, still fragile but resolute, sought Miss Marple out before breakfast. Her face, though pale, held a flicker of determination. Miss Marple, she said, her voice soft but steady, I've been thinking about what you said about trusting my mind as well as my heart. I want to understand how Aunt Beatrice could do such a thing. How did you know it was her? Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes kind but piercing. My dear, it was a matter of seeing the whole picture. Lady Beatrice's actions were not impulsive, but rooted in a past she could not escape. The locket she wore, always touched when your father's name arose, suggested a guilt she carried. Mr. Rutherford's sudden wealth and his engagement to you hinted at blackmail, a secret he held over her. The clues, the vial, the note, the cigarette butt were too neatly arranged to implicate Felix. They pointed to a mind that planned carefully, yet underestimated the power of small details. Clara nodded, her eyes glistening. Father's death. I always thought it was an accident. To know it's almost too much. Miss Marple patted her hand. The truth is often painful, but it frees us to move forward. Your aunt believed she was protecting you, but her fear led her astray. As Clara left to join the others, Inspector Hargreaves entered, his expression a mix of gratitude and curiosity. Miss Marple, I've got the coroner's full report and the handwriting analysis. The note in Rutherford's room was indeed forged close to Lady Beatrice's hand, but not exact. You were right about it being a misdirection. How did you spot it? Miss Marple smiled faintly. In St. Mary Mead, Inspector, I have seen many attempt to cover their tracks. A forged note is a common trick, but it requires a certain boldness. Lady Beatrice, with her control over this house, had the means to plant it, just as she had access to the cyanide in the garden shed. The vial, hidden so conveniently, was meant to draw attention to Felix, whom she knew disliked Julian. Hargreaves shook his head, impressed. You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. The shed's been searched. There was a small bottle of cyanide, labeled for pest control, half empty. Matches the residue in the vial, Miss Marple nodded. And the cigarette butt in the billiard room? I suspect it was placed there to bolster Felix's guilt, perhaps taken from a guest's belongings. We're looking into it, Hargreaves said. Miss Hartley admitted to smoking French cigarettes occasionally. She's no killer, but she may have been careless, leaving one for Lady Beatrice to use. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Carelessness, Inspector, is often the key to a crime's unraveling. Lady Beatrice relied on others' oversights to weave her deception. The conversation was interrupted by Felix Warrender, who approached hesitantly, his usual aloofness softened. Miss Marple, I owe you an apology. I was harsh, defensive. You saved me from being wrongly accused. Miss Marple inclined her head. No apology is needed, Mr. Warrender. You were protecting yourself, as we all do when fear takes hold. But tell me, why did you dislike Mr. Rutherford so? Felix hesitated, then sighed. He was too smooth, too eager to ingratiate himself with Aunt Beatrice and Clara. I heard rumors in London debts he'd left unpaid, deals that skirted the law. I didn't trust him with Clara's future. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. And your mother's accusation? Did you ever suspect she was shielding someone? Felix's jaw tightened. I thought she was confused or perhaps protecting herself. She's always been loyal to Aunt Beatrice. I never imagined it went so deep. As Felix left, Miss Marple reflected on the web of loyalties and betrayals that had ensnared Greystone Hall. Mrs. Warrender's accusation, though misguided, had been born of a mother's instinct to protect, twisted by Lady Beatrice's influence. Miss Hartley's feelings for Julian, Mrs. Langston's nervous revelations all were threads in a tapestry of human frailty. Later, as Miss Marple walked the grounds, her eyes lingered on the rose garden, where Lady Beatrice had tended her blooms and hidden her poison. The estate, grand and imposing, was a monument to a family's pride, now humbled by truth. She thought of Clara, who would carry the scars of this tragedy, but also the strength to rebuild. Returning to the house, Miss Marple prepared for her departure. The case, though solved, left echoes of questions about trust, about the lengths one goes to protect what is dear. As she packed her knitting, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The truth had been found not through force, but through the patient observation of human nature. Greystone Hall would heal in time, and Miss Marple would return to St. Mary Mead, where new puzzles, no doubt, awaited. Chapter 13. The unraveling threads. The afternoon sun, breaking through the lingering mist, cast a pale glow over Greystone Hall, illuminating the rose garden where Miss Jane Marple stood, her eyes tracing the neat rows of blooms. The garden, once Lady Beatrice's sanctuary, now held a darker significance, its shed having concealed the cyanide that ended Julian Rutherford's life. Miss Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, had come to reflect, her mind still weaving together the final threads of the case. Though Lady Beatrice's confession had closed the matter for Inspector Hargreaves, Miss Marple sensed a few loose ends remained, details that, while not altering the truth, might offer clarity to those left behind. Inside the house, the guests had begun to disperse, their statements taken and their roles in the tragedy clarified. Clara Ashford, though still shaken, had found a quiet resolve, spending much of the morning with Dr. Ernest Caldwell, who offered steady support. Felix Warrender, freed from suspicion, had softened toward his mother, Mrs. Lydia Warrender, whose tearful apology had begun to mend their strained bond. Miss Evelyn Hartley, her flirtation with Julian exposed as a fleeting fancy, prepared to return to London, while Mr. and Mrs. Langston spoke of leaving Greystone Hall behind, their nerves frayed by the ordeal. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by Inspector Hargreaves, who joined her in the garden, his hat in hand. "Miss Marple, you're still here," he said, a note of respect in his voice. "I thought you'd be halfway to St. Mary Mead by now." She smiled faintly, her eyes on a wilting rose. "There are times, Inspector, when one must linger to ensure all is understood. The case is solved, but the heart of Greystone Hall still beats with questions." Hargreaves raised an eyebrow. "Questions?" Lady Beatrice confessed. "The cyanide came from the shed, the note was forged, and the vial was a plant. What's left to unravel?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she drew her knitting from her bag. "Small things, Inspector. For instance, the cigarette butt in the billiard room French, you said, and Miss Hartley admitted to smoking that brand. Yet it was found where Felix claimed to be. Did Lady Beatrice take it from Miss Hartley's belongings, or was someone else in that room?" Hargreaves frowned, considering. "We assumed Lady Beatrice planted it to frame Felix, but you're right, it's a loose end. Miss Hartley's no killer, but she might know more." Miss Marple nodded. "And Mrs. Warrender's accusation? She saw someone near the library. But was it truly Felix?" Her loyalty to Lady Beatrice ran deep, as Felix himself noted. Perhaps she saw another figure and, in her fear, named her son to protect her sister. Hargreaves rubbed his chin. You think she lied deliberately? Not. Lead, Inspector, Miss Marple said gently. Misled, perhaps, by her own heart. In my village I have seen such loyalty cloud judgment. Mrs. Warrender may have suspected Lady Beatrice, but could not bear to voice it. The inspector sighed. I'll speak to her again, and Miss Hartley. But you've got me wondering, Miss Marple, what else have you noticed? She paused, her eyes drifting to the shed. The locket, Inspector. Lady Beatrice wore it as a reminder of her guilt, but also of her love for her brother. I wonder if Clara knew its significance. It might ease her pain to understand her aunt's motives, not to excuse, but to heal. Hargreaves nodded, impressed. You see more than most, Miss Marple. I'll have the locket examined. There might be a photograph or inscription inside. As they walked back to the house, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Clara. The young woman deserved peace, but the truth about her father's death and her aunt's betrayal would linger. Miss Marple resolved to speak with her before departing, to offer what comfort her words could provide. In the drawing room, Clara sat alone, staring at the portrait of Sir Henry Ashford. Miss Marple approached, her voice soft. Clara, my dear. May I sit with you? Clara nodded, her eyes weary. Miss Marple, I keep thinking about Aunt Beatrice. How could she live with what she did to father and then to Julian? Miss Marple settled beside her, her knitting resting in her lap. Some carry their guilt as a burden, others as a shield. Your aunt loved this family, but her fear of losing it led her to terrible choices. The locket she wore it held a piece. Of your father, I believe. A photograph, perhaps, to keep him close, even as she hid her crime. Clara's hand trembled. I never knew. I thought she was strong, untouchable. But she was afraid. Fear, Miss Marple said, is a powerful force. It drove Mr. Rutherford to blackmail and your aunt to murder. But you, Clara, have the strength to face the truth. Clara managed a small smile. Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't know how I'll go on, but I'll try. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The case had been solved, but more importantly, the living had been given a path forward. The cigarette butt, the locket, the note, these were but echoes of a deeper truth, now laid bare. Greystone Hall, though scarred, would endure, and Miss Marple's work for now was done. Chapter 14. The final threads. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Greystone Hall, casting a golden hue over the drawing room where Miss Jane Marple sat with Clara Ashford. The house, though still steeped in the aftermath of tragedy, seemed to breathe a little easier, as if the truth, however painful, had lifted a weight from its walls. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved with their usual rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the conversation she had resumed with Clara, whose resolve was strengthening despite her grief. Miss Marple, Clara said, her voice steadier now, you've given me much to think about, but I still wonder, how did Aunt Beatrice manage it all? The poison, the note, the vial, it seems so intricate. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. My dear, the intricate is often the simplest in disguise. Lady Beatrice was a woman of precision, accustomed to managing this estate. She knew its routines, its secrets. The cyanide from the garden shed was easily obtained, and the note, forged to resemble another's hand, was a clever misdirection. The vial, placed behind a book, was meant to point to Felix, whose dislike of Mr. Rutherford was no secret. Clara nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her handkerchief. And the locket? You mentioned it held a photograph of father. Was that why she wore it? I believe so, Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. Guilt is a heavy burden. Clara, your aunt kept your father close, perhaps to atone, perhaps to remind herself of what she had done. It was her weakness, and Mr. Rutherford exploited it. As they spoke, Inspector Hargreaves entered, his expression a mix of satisfaction and fatigue. Miss Marple, Miss Ashford, he said, nodding. We've searched Lady Beatrice's room. You were right about the locket. It contains a photograph of Sir Henry Ashford, inscribed with "Forever my brother." There were also letters, hidden in a locked drawer, detailing Julian Rutherford's demands. He was bleeding her dry, threatening to expose her role in Sir Henry's death. Miss Marple's needles paused. And the cigarette butt, Inspector. Any further light on that? Hargreaves nodded. Miss Hartley admitted to leaving a cigarette in the billiard room earlier that day. She'd slipped in for a quiet smoke, not wanting to be seen. Lady Beatrice Medians must have found it and used it to bolster Felix's guilt. We found no fingerprints on it, just as with the vial. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A careful touch, Inspector. Lady Beatrice knew the house and its guests well. She chose her tools, note, vial, cigarette, with care to shift suspicion. Clara's eyes widened. So she planned it all, knowing Felix would be suspected? Indeed, Miss Marple said. In my village, I have seen how resentment festers. Felix's distrust of Mr. Rutherford made him an easy target for her scheme. Hargreaves turned to Clara. Miss Ashford, we'll need your statement on the letters we found. They confirm Mr. Rutherford's blackmail, tying it to your father's death. It's a grim business, but it closes the case. Clara's face paled, but she nodded. I'll help however I can, Inspector. I want this to be over. Miss Marple observed Clara's quiet strength, a contrast to the fragile girl of 2 days ago. You are stronger than you know, Clara, she said softly. Greystone Hall will need that strength now. The other guests, though not present, were preparing to leave, their roles in the drama clarified. Felix Warrender and his mother, Mrs. Lydia Warrender, had reconciled, her accusation now understood as a desperate attempt to protect Lady Beatrice, whom she had long suspected but could not betray. Miss Evelyn Hartley, chastened by her own misjudgments, had apologized to Clara for her behavior, promising to return to London a wiser woman. Mr. and Mrs. Langston, eager to escape the scandal, were packing, their nervous whispers silenced by the truth dot as evening approached. Miss Marple took a final walk through the rose garden, her thoughts on the human heart. Lady Beatrice's crime, born of fear and pride, had unraveled a family, but it had also freed Clara to forge her own path. The locket, the letters, the shed's poison, these were the final threads of a tapestry woven from greed and guilt. Miss Marple returned to the house, where Clara met her at the door. Miss Marple, I've decided to stay at Greystone Hall, she said, her voice firm. This is my home, and I won't let Aunt Beatrice's actions define it. Miss Marple smiled, Her heart warmed. A wise choice, my dear. A house like a heart can heal with time. As she prepared to depart, Miss Marple felt a quiet contentment. The case had been a puzzle of motives and misdirection, solved not by force but by patience and observation. The final threads, locket, letters, cigarette had confirmed the truth, and Greystone Hall could begin to mend. She gathered her knitting, ready to return to St. Mary Mead, where new stories, she knew, awaited. Chapter 15. The quiet departure. The final morning at Greystone Hall broke with a tentative clarity, the mist that had cloaked the estate for days giving way to a pale, hopeful sun. Miss Jane Marple stood at the window of her guest room, her modest suitcase packed, her knitting bag neatly secured. The grounds below, with their orderly rose garden and silent shed, seemed to whisper of the secrets they had yielded. The house, though scarred by betrayal and loss, held a promise of renewal, embodied in Clara Ashford's resolve to reclaim her home. As Miss Marple descended the grand staircase, she found Clara waiting in the hall, her face still pale but lit with a quiet determination. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice steady, "I wanted to see you before you left. You've done so much for us, for me. I don't know how to thank you." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her smile warm. "My dear, your strength is thanks enough. Greystone Hall has seen dark days, but it is yours now to shape as you will. Trust in yourself and in the truth." Clara nodded, clutching a small velvet box. "I found this in Aunt Beatrice's room. It's the locket. I thought, perhaps you should see it before you go." She opened the box, revealing the silver locket, its surface engraved with delicate filigree. Inside was a faded photograph of Sir Henry Ashford, his stern face softened by time, and an inscription, "Forever my brother." Miss Marple studied it, her heart heavy. "A reminder of love and guilt," she said softly. "Keep it, Clara, not to dwell on the past, but to understand it. Your aunt's choices were her own, but they need not define you." Clara closed the box, her eyes glistening. "I will. I'm going to stay here, rebuild what we've lost. Felix has agreed to help, and Mother Mrs. Warrender says she'll support me." Miss Marple patted her hand. "That is wise. Family, even when broken, can mend with care." Inspector Hargreaves appeared at the door, his hat in hand. "Miss Marple, your car's ready. I've got the final report sorted, thanks to you. Lady Beatrice's confession holds, and the letters confirm Rutherford's blackmail. The case is airtight." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am glad, Inspector." "And the cigarette butt? Miss Hartley's role?" Hargreaves chuckled. "You don't miss a thing, do you?" Miss Hartley admitted to leaving the cigarette in the billiard room during a moment of indiscretion. Lady Beatrice likely found it there and used it to point at Felix. No further involvement on Miss Hartley's part, though she's learned her lesson about careless habits. Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. "And Mrs. Warrender's accusation?" "Loyalty to her sister," Hargreaves said. She suspected Lady Beatrice, but couldn't bring herself to say it. Naming Felix was her way of protecting the family, misguided. As it was, Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Human nature, Inspector, is a complex thing. Loyalty, fear, love, they drive us to strange acts, but the truth, in the end, finds its way." As she stepped into the hall, the other guests gathered to bid her farewell. Felix Warrender, his aloofness softened, offered a stiff but genuine nod. "You saved me, Miss Marple. I won't forget it." Mrs. Warrender, her face lined with regret, added, "I was wrong to doubt my son. Thank you for seeing what I couldn't." Miss Evelyn Hartley, her usual vivacity muted, managed a small smile. "I suppose I'll stick to safer company in London. Goodbye, Miss Marple." Mr. and Mrs. Langston, already packed, murmured their thanks, their relief evident as they prepared to leave the shadow of Greystone Hall behind. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, stepped into the waiting car, her thoughts turning to St. Mary Mead. The case had been a tapestry of deception, woven from greed, guilt, and fear. The locket, the note, the vial, the cigarette butt, each had played its part, revealing a truth that freed Clara and exposed Lady Beatrice. As the car wound through the misty lanes, Miss Marple reflected on the fragility of trust and the power of observation. In her quiet village, she knew, other puzzles awaited, each a chance to unravel the mysteries of the human heart. The sun climbed higher, and Greystone Hall faded from view. Miss Marple closed her eyes, her knitting resting in her lap, content in the knowledge that she had left the estate a little lighter, its secrets laid bare, its future in capable hands.